commanding the moon, a statue with flatulence and hair out of control. This can mean only one thing: witches in ancient Rome, on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil and this is a Night of the Livy Dead episode, which is a yearly Halloween themed special. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'd have noticed these over the years. I've covered a range of topics in antiquity which have a spooky motif to them. Ghosts, werewolves, exorcisms, demons, the Greek underworld. You get the idea. Last year it was curse tablets, and this year it's time for witches in ancient Rome. In this episode, I will be unpacking what the words witch and magic related to, and talking a bit about magic in Rome. Then I'll be discussing the depiction of witches in Roman literature using a few examples. The period I'm focusing on is the early imperial period, so up to and including the 1st century AD, and I should add that there's a bit of gruesomeness in this episode, as well as references to prostitution. Perhaps not best to have on speaker if young ears are around. You can summon me on X, Blue Sky, TikTok and Instagram, where I am Ancient Blogger. I also have a channel on YouTube called Ancient Blogger. This podcast has its own subreddit called Ancient History Hound as well. I'm pretty much all over the place, but in a good way, well, I hope. If there's a way that you can rate or review this wherever you are listening to it, it really helps get more exposure. And if you want to hear me talk about this podcast, I was recently on an episode of Podcasting Amplified, where I talked about how all of this happened, and continues to do so. Finally, thanks again for listening and coming back for more. Okay then, let's begin. Though this episode is titled Witches in Ancient Rome, the word witch didn't exist in Latin. It's a much later word. Instead, Rome had several names for women that are later translated as witch. It's often about context, and I will use some of those original words at points in the episode. As for what witches practiced, by that I mean magic, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, had a few things to say about it. He wrote about its origins in Persia, and linked to the religion practiced there, and how it had arisen as a branch of medicine. He also added that it was a big scam, and cited the Emperor Nero as evidence. Nero apparently was an ardent fan of magic, and devoted himself to it, but eventually gave up. Pliny's point is if there was any worth to it, Nero would have found it. Alternatively, it was so unbelievable that even Nero didn't stick with it. In the early 5th century BC, the Greek words magos and the plural magoi appear as referencing Persian priests. Though it described those priests, it may also have been a bit of an insult. Tiresias, the famous seer, is called a scheming magos by Oedipus in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex. This was an attack on Tiresias, not his trade. And when you think about it, it's unlikely that a word used to describe Persian priests used by the Greeks would be one not loaded with some amount of judgment. And this became a feature of its use in ancient Rome. Magic came to describe those activities which fell away from the conventional and therefore accepted religious practices. This might manifest in how you performed a ritual or what the ritual intended to do. There's a horrific example of the former in The Last Witch that I talk about, where an accepted practice is facilitated through a gruesome ritual. As an example of the latter, well, perhaps the ritual intended harm on a person or was dangerous for the community. As a side point, magic can be a very difficult word to define, as it was subjective and often changed in terms of specifics depending on the culture and time in question. I remember having to try to tangle with this in my master's dissertation. I hope then that this very broad description makes sense and gives you some context. Just so you know, I will be using the words magic and witch at various points for ease of purpose, with the caveat of what I have just spoken about in using these words. The earliest surviving use of the Latin word for magic, magus, didn't appear until the mid-1st century BC. But that doesn't mean that Romans were unaccustomed to it. It's more a testimony to the development of the word. There's evidence of Greek magical practices in the Italian peninsula as early as the 3rd century BC, with cursed tablets found in Etruria to the north of Rome and Bruti to the south. In terms of how Rome dealt with practices it considered magical, there are a couple of mentions of it in the 12 Tables. These are a set of laws which are thought to date to the mid-5th century BC. In Table 8, there are 2 mentions of incantations being used, one against a person and the other to charm away crops. The latter was relevant in a somewhat famous case in the 2nd century BC, where a farmer was accused of using magic to grow his crops to the detriment of his neighbours. When the farmer arrived in court, he brought with him his tools, household and oxen, and stated that these were his magic spells. He was duly acquitted. The reason for accusing him of magic may have been jealousy by his neighbours, but also snobbery. The farmer had also been a freedman, that is, an ex-slave, and so there is a sense of the other at play. Could someone who was once a slave be a better farmer than me? No, it has to be magic, which is exactly what an ex-slave might do. We find women involved in practices which could be magical in the plays of Plautus, a Roman comedic playwright who lived from 254 to 184 BC. In his play The Braggart Soldier, a character gives reasons why he isn't married. These included the costs involved in having a wife, and it extended to paying for the woman who utters incantations, the woman who interprets dreams, and the woman who divines from entrails. As mentioned, these don't have to be magical per se, but they do point to a couple of truths at the heart of the joke. That there were a range of services offered which could be considered magical, and that women expected to access these. Added to this was that it was women offering them. Plautus also used a word which is often translated to as witch, venefica. The word itself covered something like witch, but also poisoner, and this is important when we understand an association of the Roman witch, making potions. In 81 BC, a law was passed called Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Veneficis. This was primarily aimed at murderers and the sort, but also poisoners. This concluded accidental poisoning, which could be a result of a love potion gone wrong. Love potions were very popular and had been amongst the Greeks. It's difficult to know the original scope of the law as it pertained to magic, as we don't have a case in the 1st century BC where the law was cited in that context. The closest we get to a legal case involving a woman and magic occurred in AD 23 or 24. This involved a woman called Fabia Numantina, and she was charged with driving her ex-husband to madness through potions and sorcery. However, she was acquitted of the charge. A similar allegation was made by Suetonius, who wrote that a love potion given by Caligula's wife Caesonia helped cause his madness. Outside of court, magicians have been targeted by Rome through the occasional expulsion of them. In 139 BC, the Chaldeans were kicked out. This name is sometimes used to describe people from southern Mesopotamia, who were known for their abilities in astrology and magic. A rationale given here was that they were making a living from a false art and taking advantage of people who believed in it all. In 33 BC, astrologers and magicians were given the boot by Agrippa, and in AD 16, the Senate voted to expel from Italy all the astrologers and magicians. It's worth making the point that Rome was more permeable than you might think when it came to foreign religious influences. For example, adopting Cybele into the Roman religious system, something I spoke about in a recent episode on Roman festivals. There was obviously something else going on with these expulsions. Though it is one reference, there is an intriguing epitaph on a tombstone which dates to the AD 20s and suggests that witches were a threat. It relates to a witch stealing a child, and I quote, "As I grew towards my 4th year, I was seized and killed when I had the potential to be sweet for my mother and father. I was snatched by a witch's hand, ever cruel so long as it remains on the earth and does harm with its craft. Parents, guard your children well, lest grief of this magnitude should implant itself in your breast." End quote. It's unclear whether this was a part of a wider concern about child snatching. The word used here, which is translated as witch, is saga. This could mean wise woman, and we find it used elsewhere in a very different context. Both Ovid and Martial mentioned a saga helping them deal with nightmares. In Ovid's case, the saga deals with his girlfriend, who's had a very bad dream, and part of the service she offered included purifying the area around the bed. Presumably a saga or wise woman wasn't inherently viewed as bad. The theme of poets offers me a segue into my first instance of a witch. She is found in Virgil's Aeneid at the dramatic moments leading up to the death of Dido. The Carthaginian queen has heard of a Massilian priestess who possesses great skills, and I quote, "With her spells she vows to release the hearts of those she likes, to inflict raw pain on others, to stop the rivers in midstream, reverse the stars in their courses, raise the souls of the dead at night, and make earth shudder and rumble underfoot." End quote. Dido's recruitment of the priestess is to help her with what is essentially a revenge spell aimed at Aeneas. It's an extreme one, though, and will be made more potent through Dido's act of killing herself. Her final words will also form a curse, which is part of the overall spell. Virgil described the priestess standing near the pyre where Dido would take her life. She uttered an incantation to 300 gods, which included Hecate. She sprinkles water and uses herbs collected at night. The priestess is Massilian. These were a neighbouring people of the Carthaginians. It's possible, therefore, to consider her as the other, from a Carthaginian perspective, that is. Her hair is described as loose in the wind. The word used to describe her is sacerdos, which generally means priestess, but here the actions fall very much in the category of a witch. Here we meet a point engaged with earlier. It was more what the woman was doing which made her a witch, as much as anything. The loosened hair, power over nature itself, and involvement in love magic, albeit retribution in this instance, are markers we see elsewhere relating to witches and what they do. In fact, my next example, a witch called Canidia, is a great case in point. Canidia appeared in the works of the poet Horace, and there are two instances I'm going to talk about. The first is in his satires, written around 35 BC. Here we find the action taking place not on a foreign shore, but in Rome, and specifically in the gardens of Maecenas, found on the Esquiline Hill. Like many gardens, this housed a wooden figure of Priapus, who was a god associated with gardens and their protection. A famous fresco of him at Pompeii has the god weighing plentiful garden fare and balancing this on some scales with his oversized genitals. Yeah, he's that guy. Priapus takes the position of narrator and describes seeing Canidia the witch at night in the gardens. She walks barefoot with her black robe tucked up and with dishevelled hair. She is joined by Sagana, another witch, and the two scrape at the soil with their nails. The reason the pair are here is that this had once been a cemetery for the poor, and they are searching for bones to use in their various rituals. Whilst they are there, the two conduct a ritual which might sound familiar. A trench is dug, a black lamb is killed, its blood then poured into the trench. For those of you who read the Odyssey, you might recognise this as close to what Odysseus did when he wanted to speak with the dead. Priapus in fact confirms that this is their intention, and goes further to describe two dolls being used. One is woolen and the other is made of wax. The woolen one is made to embrace and crush the wax doll. This may have been a type of spell known as symplegmata, which often had the intention of forcing one person to be dominated by another. This may even include that person made to find another attractive. And that would make sense here, as there are clues as to the purpose of their visit, which I'll get to in a moment. The pair continued their activities with cries to Hecate and Tisiphone, the latter being one of the Furies. However, they're stopped in their tracks by Priapus, who passes wind very loudly from his wooden buttocks, and this startles the witches, who run off. Adding to the hilarity of the situation, Canidia drops her false teeth, along with love knots and magical herbs. Initially, the pair of witches are painted in haunted hues, but then it becomes a bit farcical. Horace seems to be poking fun at all of this by highlighting the ridiculous nature of it all. We get the sense that this related to love magic, using the dolls and the love knots carried by Canidia. This element is made more obvious in Canidia's next appearance. But before I get to that, note the description of the hair and the appeal to Hecate, both aspects we have heard of already, and these will continue to feature. The next appearance of Canidia in Horace is much less fun and far more gruesome. In the 5th Epode, an iambic poem written about 30 BC, she appears along Sagana and two other witches. 4 witches, Canidia, Sagana, Vea and Folia are in a house where they preside over a boy who they kidnapped and buried up to his neck. Food has been placed in front of him, and so emerges the horrible intention. He's being starved with food in front of him. Why though? Well, the intention was to cause the liver and marrow of the boy to become infused with longing, that is, longing for the food. These parts of the boy's body would then be used in a love potion. The longing captured in them would increase the potency of the potion. Canidia again has unkept hair, albeit this time entwined with vipers. She uses a colchian flame to burn magical ingredients in. The reference here is of Colchis, a place well known for magic and where Medea had hailed from. The other witches are involved as well, Sagana having sprinkled water on the floor of the house, with Vea resting on a mattock which she used to dig the hole the boy had been buried in. The witch Folia has an interesting ability. Horace refers to her being able to enchant the stars and moon with a Thessalian voice. It's worth making a note of this, as I'll be picking up on this with our next witch. Why was creating a love potion so important to Canidia, and why go to such extreme measures? We're offered a clue by Canidia being referred to as a palex. This was a type of prostitute who was owned and supported by a few clients. The potion is intended for Varus, who seems to have left her, and Canidia suspects that he has been himself bewitched by a rival. The context here is love, but in a quite niche context, a client fought over by rival prostitutes who use magic to maintain their clientele. Magic in the affairs of the heart, and as you'll hear, other body parts, was common. Tibullus, an Augustan poet, wrote of a saga he employed who had a range of magical abilities. She was used to create a binding spell on a woman's husband, so he would suspect nothing of their affair. Witchcraft might also be helpful if a man didn't rise to the occasion. When Ovid experienced this in bed with his girlfriend, he diagnosed it as a curse or spell by some Thessalian witch. To balance things out, a cure for impotence might be sourced from a witch. An elderly woman in Petronius' Satyricon, dated to the mid-1st century AD, is described as wearing black clothes with straggling hair. She goes by the name of Proselonos and is recruited by a lover of the main character to help cure this problem. I won't go into detail, but let's just say she is very hands-on, and it works. The link between prostitutes and love or erotic magic wasn't uncommon, and can be traced back to the Greeks, where prostitutes were often involved with potions and charms. The playwright Plautus had prostitutes acting as Venefica. Later, and in a slightly more serious context, the rhetorician Quintilian had a rhetorical exercise which featured a pimp suing the lover of a prostitute, as he believed the man had given the prostitute a love potion and stolen her away. Another declamation involved a man suing a prostitute for having given him a potion which intended to turn him away from her. Quintilian even went further when commenting that in order to know whether a woman had administered a harmful potion, you only needed to know what she did for a living. And I quote, "The whole life of a prostitute is veneficum." End quote. Prostitutes were an ideal demographic to practice love magic and be consulted upon it. There was an overlap here between the world they operated in and also a demographic looked down upon and dismissed. It's also probable that this link had been something of a tradition in Rome, inherited from the Greeks, an age-old association by the time of Quintilian. One final mention goes to the poor boy involved in the ritual. Though helpless, he does have one option left to him. Knowing that he won't survive, he curses the witches, and this motif, the words of a dying or doomed individual holding power, is something that we saw in the case of Dido. Our final witch, Erichtho, appeared in a poem by Lucan written around AD 61. His work, known as On the Civil War or Pharsalia, was set during the Civil War, which pitched Julius Caesar and Pompey against each other. In this instance, the events take place on the eve of the famous Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC. More specifically, in a region known as Thessaly. Thessaly had a reputation for magic and witchcraft. Aristophanes has a character in the comedy Clouds considering hiring a Thessalian woman to help draw down the moon so he could trap it and therefore prevent the month continuing so he wouldn't have to make any interest payments. Sosophanes, a tragic poet of the late 4th century BC, had a character in a lost play called Meleager who stated that every girl in Thessaly, and I quote, can command the moon down from heaven by magic incantations. Believe that if you will." End quote. The Greek playwright Menander wrote a comedy called The Thessalian Women, in which women called down the moon. This activity, the ability to draw down the moon, is often cited as something witches and magicians did. But why? Lucan gives a rationale for it. As the moon descends, it sheds spume, which lands on plants, and this was very valuable as an ingredient. Commanding the moon, then, was a way to get better potions, or rather better ingredients for potions. Lucan also outlined the great power of the Thessalian witches, who could change the weather and even the course of a river. The very earth might shake at their command. As possibly a homage to Circe, they were able to make dangerous animals their pets. Lucan also raises the question as to their power. How was it that the gods facilitated their spells? Were they obeying them, or were they happy to oblige? The account of Erectho begins with Sextus, son of Pompey, who wishes to learn what the outcome of the battle will be. He has heard of the witch Erectho and seeks her out. Here we come across a point made earlier. It wasn't necessarily what you were doing which qualified an activity as good or bad, but the way you did it. Lucan notes that Sextus could have asked the oracles at Delphi or Dodona. Failing that, he could have utilised augury or any other accepted practice. That Sextus chose this option is a comment on him, and this is an interesting nuance. The negative context wasn't just applicable to a person undertaking the activity, i.e. the witch, but also the person requesting it. Sextus searches for Erectho at night and eventually finds her on a cliff amongst some unburied bodies. Lucan goes into grisly detail as to how this is what most concerned Erectho. Dead bodies were her thing, and she is described in various examples of how she would harvest parts from them. When Sextus finds her, she is performing a spell, which she hopes will ensure that the battle between Caesar and Pompey takes place nearby, so she has access to all those fresh corpses. Erectho is described as haggard, and her face vile with neglect. Her hair, as you will now expect, is uncombed. She only seems to emerge at night or when black clouds obscure the sky. Lucan comments on her powers, and I quote, "The gods grant every horror at the first cry of her voice, dreading a second incantation." End quote. Here we get a sense of the question Lucan posed. These Thessalian witches, or at least Erectho, seem to have leverage over the gods. Sextus convinces her to help him, and they make their way back to her cave, with Erectho dragging a corpse she has selected for the ritual. The cave is dank, its entrance shaded by yew trees. Once inside, Erectho changes into a multi-coloured garment and wreathes her hair with vipers. Sextus and his companions are terrified. The corpse is treated by Erectho. It has fresh blood poured into the wounds, and the entrails are washed and a poison is poured into them, which includes the ingredient taken from the moon and spittle from a rabid dog. Next, she utters shrieks and cries, followed by an appeal naming the Furies, Hecate, and other underworld figures, whilst referencing her many gory offerings to them. This manner of appeal is made in a recognisable format, requesting assistance from a deity, whilst reminding them of your service to them, usually citing offerings. Erectho's appeal contains nothing of the standard fare you might expect, no fine cattle sacrificed in their name. These offerings include organs and body parts. It's a perversion of the standard appeal format, which itself sits well in this context. After all, seeking prophecy was a perfectly fine thing to do, but not in this manner. Erectho then switches her appeal to something more like a threat, demanding that the underworld obeys her in sending a shade into the corpse. She is successful, and the corpse stands upright. At this point, the horror of it all is suspended, and instead you feel pity. What is standing isn't some formidable zombie or undead warrior. Lucan notes it's sad flesh, and as it begins to speak, tears flow down its face. Eventually, Sextus gets his answer, which isn't what he was hoping for. As you may know, his father lost against Caesar. After burning the body, Erectho delays the onset of dawn so she can escort Sextus and his companions back to camp under the cover of night. Lucan's description of Erectho is powerful and dramatic. I don't think she'd scarper because of a statue which had a bit of IBS. Of course, we should appreciate that this depiction, as with those of other witches, was made with a particular audience and intent in mind. Sextus was on the wrong side of history, and Lucan would therefore happily associate him with the worst type of practices. That said, even Sextus seems horrified at points. There's also a nice embellishment of the reputation Thessaly had. The examples I've given of witches in Roman literature contain some commonalities, the wild hair and ability to change nature itself. There are often recognised deities involved in the incantations. They might be met in a range of situations, from the extreme, such as we've just heard, to the more intimate. In respect to the more intimate magic, I wonder how this was perceived. Presumably, a ritual to harm someone else's chances in love or cause them heartbreak was considered magic. I go back to the point about that law which dealt with poisoners, where a love potion may have only been seen as dangerous if it was poisonous. I began this episode by stating how difficult magic might be to define when it wasn't an obviously negative thing. A saga lending a limp lover a helping hand or dealing with nightmares could, for some people, be considered magic simply because it had elements of the other about it. For others, it might be a rebalancing and a sort of counter to magic, so presumably okay. On a day-to-day level, I wonder how it was viewed. It might seem silly, but to give this some modern perspective, I remember someone I knew from school getting into all sorts of trouble when her parents found a deck of tarot cards in her room. They considered this a step away from full-blown Satanism. Now, the only thing which would have shocked my parents, had they found a deck of tarot cards in my room, was that they could find a deck of tarot cards in my room, because I wasn't exactly the tidiest. Magic, therefore, might be in the eye of the beholder, obvious examples excepted. And on that moment of self-reflection, I come to the end of the episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, and let me know what you thought of it. Until next time, have a great Halloween, keep safe, and stay well.